Good morning.
Good morning. Hi.
First, and I didn't write this down, but for those of you who knew Holly, she always had her chalice necklace on. And I can't remember the story that she told me about who had given this to her. It was some special event, but I don't remember. But I remembered that after I had put together some notes. Also, there in the back on the foyer on the table there are copies of Holly's obituary, and then there are also copies of some memories that Mark and Susan Sanderson had of Bob and Madeline Farragon. So help yourself if you're interested, and they are back there just as you go outside the double doors on the right. I don't remember actually when I first met Holly, but one of my earliest memories is because of the place we were meeting as a church didn't provide any other time other than on Sunday morning. All of our other activities met in homes or other places. And it happened to be at that time, we had a program for young people called Our Whole Lives. And Holly's oldest daughter, Becky, was involved in that. And my spouse, Terry, was one of the teachers along with Diana Jenner, yes, yeah. And so it was a group effort, and they would all descend upon our house, and Holly and I would get a cup of tea and disappear. And we had many conversations, because it was not just a one-week session, it was many weeks. So then Becky was done, and it was time for Nolan. And by that time we had a place where we could meet, and so we had some conversations there too. Her children were absolutely the light of her life. She was so proud of them. She spent hours helping them with their 4-H projects and their Boy Scout and Girl Scout projects. And they included maybe some more unusual critters. With her history and masters in wildlife biology, they had ducks and turkeys and specialty chickens as their 4-H projects. Summers were spent going to the Parker Public Pool or Wildwater West, and winter was spent skiing either at Terry Peak or Great Bear. And she was active in all of those. One of the next really poignant memories I have is getting a call for her asking me to come out to the Sioux Falls Airport where she was part of the flight instructor team. And I walked, and you got the call, and I thought, well, this is unusual, because I'm not, I fly, I like flying, but I'm not anywhere near the level, and she was excellent at it, excellent. And I got there, and I went to her, where her little office was, and she said, I'm having a stroke. Not I have had a stroke, but I am having a stroke. And she shared that she had a bleed really deep in her brain, that they couldn't do anything to stop. It just had to do its thing. It did stop. She was left with huge amounts of excruciating pain. And in order to control that, she was given medication. Well, those two things in tandem prevented her from ever flying again. And her flying gave her great joy. There's no other way to describe it. She could tell you by just hearing whatever plane was going by. How big it was, how little it was, model number, she knew them all. She was a flyer. Later, after the bleeded step stabilized, one of our members at that time, John Hutchinson, offered her the position of secretary for the church. We had grown to the point where we needed help in the office, and she was hired as our secretary. As it happens, most jobs kind of morph and grow, and it became increasingly more challenging for Holly. And thank you, Reverend Armida, helped her through that time along with John Hutchinson and others, but it continued to expand beyond at the limits of her scope of doing. The stroke had left damage that you couldn't see but was there, to the point where she had to have remembrances on her phone to take her pain pills, because otherwise, to eat, it just, the stroke had taken some of those things away. So the next thing I remember, Holly and I both loved strawberries. And she had discovered, through her connections in Parker, that there was this you pick your own strawberry field out west of Parker. So I would pick up souffles from Panera and pick her up, and this was early in the morning, and we would eat our souffles as we drove to the You Pick On. We'd pick our field, our fill, whatever we had decided we wanted, and you could pick as much as you wanted, and then drive back and talk about what we were going to do with them. And I remember when she said, "You know what? I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to leave them on the counter, and I'm going to eat them, all of them." And Holly didn't like to cook. She hated to shop. And so it was with effort that she would, plan ahead, even at that time, and do things. Another thing I remember is we were struggling to find a place to board our daughter's horse. What a interesting saga that was. And Holly knew of it and offered to let us board at her barn. And they had this beautiful, beautiful brand new barn with great stalls and a place to store the hay. And it housed the kids' 4-H projects. So Terry went out and built fence, around it so that the horse could do something else other than just stand in the stall. Becky, her daughter, thought she might like to learn to ride. And so we worked with her a little bit, and she decided, it wasn't for her. She'd have to wear shoes and couldn't wear flip-flops, and so it wasn't for her. One of the other things we enjoyed was having lunch with Janelle Lenzer. We didn't meet often, maybe every 3, maybe 4 months, but we'd gather and solve every problem you can imagine. It was a true gab fest. Holly loved her farm home. It had gotten hit by a tornado, and they had to rebuild a lot of it. And they had put in this amazing fireplace. And in the wintertime, that fire was never out. She loved that fireplace. She loved her dogs. She loved the cat that showed up that finally decided to come in. She loved our national parks. They were special to her, and as often as she could, she traveled to them. Her last trip was with her daughter Becky, and they had been to Glacier National Park, one of her favorites. And it had turned out to be not quite the trip they'd planned, and they ended up coming home early. Holly was a lifelong Unitarian. She's the only one I have ever known. And she grew up knowing that what was important was what was here and now. Not later, not tomorrow, not somewhere in the future, but now. And that's how she lived her life. She was my friend, and I miss her.
Oh,
Oh, sorry.
oh, that's okay. Okay, my name's Eric Berg, and been a member here for a couple of years, but known Bob and Madeline for quite a while. And what I have here are notes from Mark Sanderson and Susan Randall, edited, added to, and deleted from by yours truly. And so some of this is Mark and Susan's words, and some of it are mine. But, you know, when I was starting this off, I thought, what is my attitude? What is my feeling towards Bob? And the word wistful came up. It's a word that's not often used, but you know, my feelings towards their passing is one of wistfulness. We've been deeply moved by the lives and now the deaths of these two beautiful people, so much so that emotions and rational thought are hard to separate. They are precious elder role models for us, and delivering these words in writing will allow us to communicate more clearly and less emotionally the full arc of their lives. Their lives, as an abridged version, is as follows. Bob and Madeline were married 71 years. They spoke often of reaching the end of their journey together, and so it was. Madeline passed away, aged 93, on November the 19th, and Bob, aged 96, passed away 1/2 day later, on November the 20th. Madeline Melrose graduated with a BA in English from the University of Iowa. She worked in library sciences, was active in the League of Women Voters, and was the caring mother of 4 children, grandmother to 6, and great-grandmother to 2. Her enormous creativity found expression in knitting, weaving, playing the piano, and singing in numerous community choruses. As an aside, Madeline did have radical thoughts. Why can't women retire from cooking as men retire from career work? So they started eating out more often, and she started distributing her cookbooks and equipment. Bob also graduated from the University of Iowa with a major in English. He continued that work in the Iowa Writers' Workshop, earning a master's degree in fine arts. Bob's professional career after teaching, Bob's career began as an English professor but veered into the field of rural electrification and cooperatives when he assumed the directorship of the East River Electric Power Co-op in Madison, South Dakota, where his family was raised. The peak of his career was to be appointed by President Jimmy Carter to be the administrator of the Rural Electrification Administration inside the Department of Ag. Retirement was a long adventure for them. Back to Madison, winters in Texas, camping trips throughout the United States, a move to Texas, and then a move to Sioux Falls. When Madeline's health began to falter, they made their final move to Wilmette, Illinois, where they lived with daughter Martha and her husband Frank in a granny flat addition built especially for them. This gave them a cozy, comfortable, and enlightened domicile for their final years. This was also just a couple miles away from the Baha'i temple in Wilmette, and they loved to go there and sit and just feel the ambiance. It's a wonderful place. Their relationship to All Souls, they moved to Sioux Falls around 2004 and made our church a priority in their lives. Mark Sanderson can pinpoint their presence with us by a distinct memory of a Sunday morning at the Pink Church at 9th and Cliff. Mark was the worship service leader, and our pianist couldn't make it. At the last minute, Madeline volunteered to step in and play. Mark opened the hymnal on the grand piano and held the pages open while she sight-read and accompanied us. This memory is one of joyful volunteerism with a healthful spirit. Bob's thoughtful comments during circle discussion made the worship service, part 2, as meaningful as a formalized service. Bob was still a writer, a poet, a gifted leader, and a doer in the world. When a newsletter editor was being sought, Bob stepped in and offered to do it. He wrote and edited, with assistance from Susan Randall, an updated history of the All Souls Church, growing the seeds of a liberal faith. And there will be a couple of copies out in the back also. Bob completed this work just as he was relocating to Wilmette. He also wrote a self-published mystery novel, The Albino Stag Witness, read by the book group, and also a book of poetry. We kept in contact with Bob and Madeline in their new retirement home in Wilmette and had a growing appreciation for Martha and Frank's generous offer of their home to them. During their later years, Madeline's memory loss was gradual, and Bob's caretaking role increased. Frequent visits to the Chicago Botanical Gardens with Martha as the chaperone were deeply spiritual for Bob. A poem inspired by the waterfalls in the garden is as follows. Falling waters amid frequencies confusing of sense. The reason spies confer next to shopping mall pools. I go to the botanical garden to learn its cryptic sense, patient meditation translating for my anxious soul. Tourists hurrying by on the pathways see falling water, while I conjure meanings from the churning pool. It is here I discover myself made free in a greener world of our natural home, offering epiphanies of its grace. Always a courageous seeker and full of gratitude for the life he lived, Bob commented in a letter that he wrote at age 95 of his life among us in Sioux Falls and at All Souls Church. Quote, I no longer want to argue about the flavors of religious motivations in our community. I want to respect people who practice their faith without demanding it be reflected in legislation control of human rights of others. It's a tough issue. Unitarian Universalism offers, with its principles, a good enough base. My experience of it at All Souls was so important to me that I idealized it more than a rationalist ought. What do you think? What do we think, Bob and Madeline? If we were able to meet you face to face now, we would hold your hands and ask you to join us in reciting the 7th principle. We affirm and promote the interdependent web of all living things of which we are a part. We celebrate Bob and Madeline's lives and grieve their passing.
Good morning. I'm Greg Boris, and my presentation will be less personal than the last two. When we first started doing these services of remembrance, I was involved with it and have been involved with it most years since. And as I go through every year, when someone dies, I go, would that be a person that would be appropriate for the service? And this last month or two has been very busy, and I sort of forgot about it, and then Sue Ann reminded me, hey, can you do something? I said, sure. So here I am. One of the things that I learned in doing these over the years is something Ann Essie taught me. She said, when you say something, when people say stuff up here, you spark an idea, you spark something to do. And so Eric, when he speaks of Baha'i Temple in Wilmette, Illinois, it is a wonderful place. Joan and I used to live real close to that, and we would go there. The botanical gardens, Joan's late sister has a tree that's cared for in her honor there. And both are wonderful places to go. And hopefully I'll leave you with a couple of things to consider doing today. You know, so many have left us in this world in 2021, and then you throw COVID into the mix, and that just sort of exacerbates the situation. As I look through the list of people who have died, and that are of note, at least in some people's minds, a lot of them list that they died due to COVID. And I'm sure there were many who did not have that designation, but who also were affected by COVID. So unlike the past where I picked out one person, I'm going to pick out several. And what I tried to do was look for a theme. My initial thought on themes was, let's pick out nasty people who are no longer with us, and we are thankful for their departure. I thought, nah, that's probably not good. That's not appropriate. Let's be more uplifting. And given that my interest in sports, I thought, well, let's do something sports related. Well, sports related can some people can identify with sports. Some people just forget, what's this Super Bowl thing? Go away from that. So I wanted to do something more uplifting. So I looked at the arts. And so my focus today are people in the world of the arts who have endured in some way, and particularly the importance of arts in these COVID times. Now, about 20 years ago, our educational system basically went to math and science and reading, and basically cut out arts and music and phys ed programs. And if you look around our communities, you look around the nation, having fine arts programs has really diminished. Yet when COVID comes in, what do people do? They binge watch. They watch Netflix, they watch Hulu, they listen to music. They engage in the arts from their home because they can't go out. When I was growing up, we had very few books in our house, and luckily there was a library. The distance from our house, if we were here, would be where Lincoln High School is, which was great. We had one of those big old TVs, more furniture than TV, and we had one radio in the house, although I had a hidden transistor radio that I could listen to on the slide. There were no movie theaters nearby. So the first person that I want to draw attention to is a woman who died this past spring at the age of 104, and that's Beverly Cleary. Beverly Cleary was best known for her Ramona books, her Henry Huggins books. Beverly Cleary grew up in Oregon, went to school, and at that time, during the Depression, and even after that time, kids were grouped, and there were the bluebirds, and the cardinals, and the blackbirds. She was a blackbird because she didn't read. She couldn't read. She had problems reading. And she didn't want to be a blackbird, but all the kids who couldn't read were blackbirds. And finally, in third grade, she came across a set of books as a kid called the Dutch Twins books. And these were stories about ordinary kids. And that got her reading. Time goes on. During the Depression, people didn't have money. The community college in Los Angeles had very low tuition, so she moved there, got a two-year degree, came back and was admitted to UC Berkeley. for a 2-year degree in English, and then got a degree in library science. Then she moved to Yakima, Washington, which is a very mixed community, a native community, a white community, a very remote rural community in south central Washington, where she became the town's librarian. Following that, she started doing writing, and also fell in love with a guy who unfortunately wasn't Roman Catholic like she was, and he was Presbyterian, and that caused all sorts of problems. They got married and stayed married for 64 years. Obviously not too many problems. But during that time, they moved to California, and she wrote, and she wrote, and she wrote, and she wrote, and she won award after award for her writing. And as a kid, I read Ramona books. As a parent, I read those books. Now as a grandparent, we'll be doing that too. So, if you haven't read Beverly Cleary, read Beverly Cleary. The second person I want to draw attention to is someone that not many people know, but may know about him through his music. Some of you know the music, may remember the movie Zorba the Greek with Anthony Quinn, and people dancing like this in the movie. And you may remember some of the music from them. The music was composed by a fellow named Mikis Theodorakis. Mikis Theodorakis was born in 1925. He died this past September. Like Beverly Cleary, he was married a long time, only 53 years in his case. He wrote music not just for Zorba the Greek, but the movie Z, not the current movie Z, but the 1960s movie Z, which is available on Amazon Prime, which is about the Greek junta dictatorship revolution in the late 1960s. One of the true marks of an effective artist is when the government bans your work. It says not only can you not play his music, but you'll be thrown in jail if you are even caught listening to his music. And Mikis Theodorakis was such a person. If you were listening to his music, even on the sly, and someone caught you, into jail you went. Into jail he went many times for his music and for his advocacy, political advocacy against the junta, in speaking out in favor of Greek-Turkish Cypriot relationships. And he just did all sorts of things. They exiled him to, almost like Napoleon at Elba. They sent him out to an island and they tortured him and they buried him alive twice. I mean, they just did nasty things to this man. Finally, the colonels were overthrown, and Theodorakis was able to come back to Greece and become a member of parliament and became active. So if you haven't seen Z, I would encourage you to do it. It's a thriller, it's true, mostly. It's almost like historical fiction, but a lot of the truth is there. One of my favorite French movie stars is in there, Yves Montand, and it's a wonderful movie. Music. When I was growing up, there was this battle of the bands between this group called the Beatles and a group called the Rolling Stones. And there were the Beatles peoples and there were the Rolling Stones people. And I vacillated. But one of the early Rolling Stone songs I remember listening to on the transistor radio was "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." And you know, since that time I've continued to listen to the Rolling Stones, and this past August, Charlie Watts, the drummer for the Rolling Stones since 1963, died. Now, Charlie Watts was not just a drummer for the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones would go on tour, and then they finished their show, and then he'd go to some jazz club, and he would play at a jazz club. And you just show up, and he would sit in. He also You know, in the 20 years ago, my late friend Jay Heath, who some of you knew, I said to Jay, you know, the Rolling Stones are playing up in Minneapolis, let's go. And he said, sounds good. He said, how much does it cost? I told him, and he almost died. But that came later. Jay and his son Derek and I went up to the Rolling Stones to the Bridges to Babylon concert, and then I didn't know it then, but they had this elaborate set designed by Charlie Watts. He was a set designer. In the world of music, rock and roll music, it's often the situation where the band follows the drummer sets the tone, the drummer sets the beat. In the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards set the tone and Charlie Watts followed along. He was a subtle drummer. He was very different than the others. He also, there are many stories about Charlie Watts. The one I'll tell, there was a book that came out several years ago called Sympathy for the Drummer. It's sort of a biography of Charlie Watts. And the author is, I believe, a Canadian dude. And it came out and got published, and you know, people read it. And then one morning, the author gets up, and there's a message on his voicemail from like 3 in the morning, like, hello, Mr. Smith, this is Charles Watts. I just want to know if I can visit with you. And Charles Watts? Charlie Watts? So the author calls up the number that was on the phone and gets Charlie Watts, who proceeds to visit with him and talk about how much he liked the book. And the time difference was not in Charlie Watts' mind when he made the call. He didn't know where this author was, I suppose. So Charlie Watts, if you passed, and I encourage you, if you haven't, listen to some Rolling Stones music. And I'm going to conclude with 2 words. Betty White.